Hello everyone, we'll continue with Chapter 9, and this is Lecture 2, and we're going to develop a simple model of aggregate demand. So, one of the first things we want to talk about is this idea of time horizon. So far we have focused on the long run. All right, that has been our focus so far, is the long run, where prices are flexible and respond to changes in supply or demand. So essentially, in the long run, we really haven't thought too much about aggregate demand. Why? Because prices are flexible, markets can move, factors are mobile, everything is sufficiently long run that everyone can kind of figure out, well, okay, I can't work as an electrician, so I'll go retool and become a plumber. There's enough time to do all of that. The next step, though, is to start thinking about the short run. And in the short run, well, prices are often what we call sticky. In other words, you can't just change your price. For example, inflation goes up. Well, just because inflation goes up doesn't mean my wage rate goes up. So if inflation goes up, then my nominal wage goes down relatively faster than it did before, right? Okay, what happens if I have an increase in demand for, whatever the latest, greatest thing to buy at the store is, right? What happens? Do they raise the price? No, oftentimes what happens is they run out, right? Think about the latest and greatest whatever, right? iPod, iPad, iPhone, whatever, right? Supply is always short to begin with. Well, they could just raise the price to a point that, well, supply wouldn't be short. There would just be less quantity demanded, right? But they don't. Why? Because, well, raising prices and changing prices in general can be quite costly. So, oftentimes we think of prices as being sticky. Well, the economy behaves rather differently when prices are sticky. So, we should expect fairly different behavior from the economy in the long run versus the economy in the short run, which is also why when we start thinking about economic policy, for example, we have to think very differently about long-run economic policy than we have to think about short-run economic policy. Now, ultimately, the two have to cohere with one another because we have one, kind of coherent world that we're working in. But there will be different tools depending on the types of problems that we have. And in the short run, different types of problems arise than do in the long run. And so the second half of this material in the semester that we're doing is primarily focused on, well, short run behavior. So let's get a brief recap of what's going on so we can get some context. So all this slide is right now is just a little bit of context of where we've been so that we can see where we're going. All right, so output from chapters 3 to 8, output is determined by the supply side. Supply of capital and labor and technology. So the amount of resources we have and our production function. That's what determines the amount of supply. And output's determined by that. Because it's a long run, we assume essentially we're in equilibrium. Changes in demand for goods and services, C, I, and G, only affect prices, not quantity. Why? Because we'll always assume that we're in that equilibrium state. And, well, what's there? The quantity doesn't change, so what's there to fluctuate? Price level. So in the long run, what we see is changes affecting price level only. And we're assuming complete price flexibility, so prices can change in order to accommodate any kinds of shocks that we talk about. And, well, yes, applies to the long run. We've been talking about this. We have been in a very much a long run framework all the way up until now, and now we're ready to switch gears and talk about the short run. However, when prices are sticky, so now we're moving towards the short run, output and employment also depend on demand, which is affected by things like fiscal policy, monetary policy, and other factors like exogenous changes in consumption or investment, right? Major shocks, natural disasters, natural non-disasters, the opposite, good things that happen. Not all things that happen in nature are bad, right? Sometimes we get sunshiny days, which are good. That could increase consumption, especially if you are at a beach. So, the basic paradigm of most mainstream economists and policymakers use to think about economic fluctuation and policy to stabilize the economy. So, one of the things that we want to think about is, oftentimes the idea is this. Very simply, if I put, say I want to put time here, and I put real GDP here, and I want to say that, well, in the long run, the economy goes about like this. All right? It has a growth rate of about 3%. Okay? That's not what we have plotted here, but what we have here is the level of real GDP. But we can say that it's growing at about a 3% rate. Okay. Now, when we take a look at the business cycle fluctuations, we see that, well, the business cycle does this. So real GDP is actually kind of waving about or wiggling about that trend line. Now, the idea behind policy is simple. Make that wave have lower amplitude. So, longer, more sustained expansions and shorter, shallower recessions. So what are the pluses of that? The pluses of that are simple. One, we smooth out our income stream, so that makes it easier for us to consume the same amount every time. We like to have smooth consumption. And we minimize things like unemployment. When we have unemployment that becomes too low, or when we have a recession, we have an increase in unemployment. Unemployment tends to be very disruptive, and so we can minimize that. And other things that we can minimize by trying to dampen out that business cycle. Now that sounds like a really great idea, and for the most part I think it's right, but we may have to think about, as we think about the business cycle, well, why do we have recessions in the first place? And maybe they do serve a purpose, so maybe we don't want to completely dampen the business cycle out entirely. I don't know, we just have to look at that and see, think about it a bit. All right, and well, we show how price level and aggregate output are determined. That's one of the things that we want to look at. We want to figure out, well, how do we get a price level? And how do we figure out output? And how does that differ in the short run from the long run? And then, well, that leads us to our final point. How does the economy's behavior differ in the long run versus the short run? These are all kind of our goals out of this model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. We want to see if we can use that to give us a way to come up with a strategy to smooth the business cycle, explain price level and output determination, and then see the difference between short run and long run. So, aggregate demand. The demand curve shows the relationship between price level and quantity of output demanded. All right, and remember, this is quantity of what? Aggregate output demanded. So these are all the demand curves added up. So for this chapter's introduction to the aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve, we're going to use a very, very simple version of aggregate demand. And it's going to be based on the quantity theory. So you've seen the quantity theory before, and we're just going to run with that a little bit. Now, we will develop a much better model in Chapter 10 and 11, but what's really amazing is how much explanatory power this really simple, kind of cheesy, to be honest, model really has. So, from Chapter 4, remember the equation of exchange, or the quantity equations. MV, money stock times velocity equals the price times output. All right, so nominal expenditure equals nominal money spent, or money times velocity equals nominal expenditure. So, for given values of M and V, this requires an inverse relationship between P and Y. Notice, well, you can see that algebraically. Just solve for Y, and you'll notice that Y equals MV over P, right? As P goes up. What has to happen if those guys stay constant? Because remember, we have a given value of those two. Y has to go down. There's inverse relationship. And so what do we have? Well, we have an aggregate demand function. Very simple aggregate demand function that doesn't have a lot of room for lots of really cool modern things that happen, but actually, when we get right down to it, it's going to help us explain a lot of stuff about the economy. So even though it's a simple, cheesy model, it's actually well worth studying. So what did we just talk about? An increase in price level causes what to happen? Well, a fall in real money balances, causing a decrease in demand for goods and services. So that's getting just a little bit ahead of ourselves. We're going to go into that in a lot more detail once we get something called an LM curve. But for now, just realize, think about it this way. If price level goes up, what happens to the value of the money in your bank account? It goes down. And if the value of the money in your bank account goes down, what happens to your spending? It goes down. Right? Basically, that's all we're saying here. So an increase in the money supply, though, shifts aggregate demand curve to the right. Now what's going on? If I increase money, then what happens? Well, then I have this M over V over P equals Y, right? And M goes up, what has to happen? Y goes up, but did P change? No. So what happens? Well, I have to have a rightward shift in aggregate demand. Okay, and that gives us this very simple introduction to the aggregate demand model, and we'll continue this with the next lecture.